I've worked throughout my career in all aspects of defense acquisition and national security, including as in uniform as an Army officer, as a civil servant. It's not about just taking risk for the sake of taking risk. It's about managing risk intelligently.
How can small and mid-sized government contractors best align themselves with the Air Force modernization goals?
Build relationships with both the operational community and the buying commands. We're in a competition for technological superiority.
How do you see artificial intelligence?
Artificial intelligence was just software that works.
How important is talent acquisition?
At the end of the day, quality of the people matters first.
All right. If you go ahead and just introduce yourself.
I'm Frank Kendall. I was Secretary of the Air Force during the Biden administration, and I was Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics during the Obama administration. I've worked throughout my career in all aspects of defense acquisition and national security, including as in uniform as an Army officer, as a civil servant, as a senior executive in industry at various levels, large and small corporations, and as a consultant and a board member. So I get a wide range of experience in defense industry and acquisition.
Yeah, I know you've had a remarkable career starting over at West Point
Yep.
and then Georgetown Law.
Eventually, I went from West Point to Caltech first. I got
Okay.
2 degrees in engineering. I consider myself an engineer first and foremost, but I have a law degree. I'm still licensed to practice law. I've done pro bono human rights law for the most part, but having the law degree has been very helpful in a lot of the other things that I've done. Similar with the MBA, I picked up an MBA when I was teaching engineering at West Point, and that's been a very helpful degree to have as well.
Wow. So what initially inspired your path into public service?
Well, my parents are, greatest generation people, World War II. My father was a veteran in World War II. I was drawn to the military for a combination of reasons, a lot of interest in history and leadership, and the technical aspects of things. So kind of combined those and made a decision when I was very young that I wanted to go to a service academy and then achieved that. I also spent a year at RPI before I went to West Point. So
Okay.
got a strong it was a space age, so that influenced me a lot. Great interest in aviation. But the Air Force wouldn't let me be a pilot, so I didn't go to the Air Force Academy, and the Navy wouldn't take me at all because I didn't have 20/20 vision, so I didn't go to the Naval Academy.
Okay.
So I was fine with West Point. I had about 11 years of active duty. I was an air defender, but I fairly quickly got into research and development and into developing ballistic missile defense capabilities. And then while I was working for the Army doing ballistic missile defense systems, President Reagan started the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative program. And so nothing is ever dead forever. And Golden Dome is around now to resurrect some version, I expect, of SDI. So maybe that experience will be of value, the next chapter here.
That's interesting. Now, I'm not familiar with STI. So can you help us for those of us who are not historians?
Sure. SDI was the Strategic Defense Initiative, and it was started in March of 1983. President Reagan had the aspiration and the vision to provide a defensive dome, if you will, over the United States in particular, protect the population from nuclear attack. So he
Mm,
launched a program, set up a 3-star Air Force general actually to run it, and put tons of money into it. I ended up being the Army's lead for system engineering and operational analysis from about 83 until 86, when I came to my first job in the Pentagon, where I had oversight of strategic defense programs, which included the Strategic Defense Initiative, but also Continental Air Defense and counter space programs. And I did that job for about 2.5, 3 years, and then switched over to being the lead for the Secretary of Defense for tactical warfare programs.
that's interesting. And now tell people, for those who don't know about the Golden Dome, what is the Golden Dome?
Well, it's just been announced, and I don't think we know what it is yet for sure. It seems to be a son of SDI. Um, the SDI program never completed its effort. There were a number of shifts and emphasis in it. The Soviet Union collapsed before we ever fielded much in terms of capability. And there were a lot of questions about cost and whether it would actually be effective. Um, I think Golden Dome is going to suffer from some of the same concerns, but it was announced by the president recently as a desire to protect the United States. And it isn't clear whether he is intending to provoke population centers, that seems to be the desire, or critical assets, which is actually a much easier job. So We don't know yet. He announced from the Oval Office that he's going to put 175 billion into this. I think there's about 25 billion in the reconciliation bill, which the Congress is working on now. My former vice chief of space operations, General Mike Gutlein, has been tapped to be the director of this program. It'll be a program that spans the Missile Defense Agency, the Space Force, the intelligence community, and I'm sure others. So it's very formative stages right now. Everybody's trying to figure out exactly what it's going to be and how it's going to be conducted and what industry opportunities there'll be.
And speaking of that, I mean, you manage a budget similar to that nature, right? Right, just before you left, about $170 billion, 700,000 personnel.
That was an individual year. That was our annual budget for the Air and Space Force combined. We requested in 25 was 215 billion, about
Mm.
30 billion for the Space Force and the balance for the Air Force. The SEI program looks like it, they're throwing a lot of money at a single program very quickly. That's a recipe for waste generally, and inefficiency, but it's a way to try to go quickly if you want to do that, if that's your driving consideration. So most estimates of what the Golden Dome might cost are closer to $500 billion than 175 or more. And I would be inclined to err on that side. I think it's going to be if it's going to be reasonably effective, it's going to cost a lot more than the numbers I'm hearing right now.
Let's talk about just before we started, I brought the conversation with CSIS, and you talked about the Air Force in 2050 and Space Force in 2050. Can we touch on some of that?
Sure. The Congress asked me to do a report on the Department of the Air Force in 2050. What should we be in 2050, basically? And I actually wrote it myself. I thought about various ways to do it, but what I ended up doing was drafting it myself and having a number of other people take a look at it and give me feedback on it. And it lays out a preferred future in which the Air Force gets the resources it needs, but it moves very strongly in the direction of strengthening our power projection capability and doing so against key competitor being China, which is investing very heavily to try to defeat both the Air Force and the Space Force and U.S. forces in general. It envisions embracing what we call artificial intelligence, which I would prefer to talk about in terms of automation and autonomy. It follows up the current collaborative combat aircraft program that I started with next generation of those and has that filled in numbers by that period of time. Shifts the balance of our power projection capability away from short range forward-based capabilities, fighters basically, to longer range systems. Right now, the Air Force is very skewed towards the fighter side of the house. Has to field resilient transportation systems as well. The threat's reaching out to engage tankers and transports at longer and longer ranges. So we have to respond to that. So take steps to do all those things. And of course, fields integrated command and control and robust defense of our air bases. So a lot of the things that I addressed under the initiatives I talked about as operational imperatives, I envisioned them being fulfilled, that those imperatives would be met and things would be fielded. On the Space Force side, and those tend to be evolutionary for the Air Force, but that path I think is pretty clear. On the Space Force side, complete the transformation that we've started from essentially a force that was designed for peacetime and operate with impunity to one that's ready to fight in space, both to protect the services that we provide to the Joint Force and our partners, to have resilient systems, and also the ability to deny the adversary, again, primarily China, Russia also, of course, but primarily China. They're targeting systems that they're trying to field in space and have fielded, as well as be resilient enough to be survivable against the counter space systems that they've fielded. In all of this, there's an emphasis on entering new technologies. Artificial intelligence is a big part of that. Autonomy is a big part of that. But there are other areas where advances are taking place, like quantum technologies for sensing and computing, as well as some of the modern communications technologies. Um, there are not obvious direct applications of some of the biological technologies, but you have to think about human-machine interfaces and how you can facilitate those. So there are a lot of things that are the direction in which they're moving is fairly clear. How far they're going to get by that time frame is uncertain. But I think it is fairly clear that we will need a fairly significantly transformed Space Force and Air Force by 2050 that are very different than the ones we have right now.
You mentioned artificial intelligence. We talked a little bit about it. It seems like that's the new buzzword everyone's using. How do you see artificial intelligence? You kind of
Yeah,
glanced
we
over
talked
that.
about that
Just wanna.
earlier. I mentioned that Alex Karp, the head of Palantir, the founder of Palantir, made a comment at a conference a year or so ago that artificial intelligence was just software that works. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And we've been talking about artificial intelligence for several years now. It goes back, oh, I would say at least 6 or 7 years. Um, and there has been a dramatic improvement in our ability to do computation and the types of problems we can address and how well we can solve them. The first wave of that was in areas like data analytics, pattern recognition, the ability to sift through large amounts of data and provide products very quickly to support decision makers, to do course of action analysis, for example. So it was an extension of things we already had. And it was proliferating. It was before I came back into government in 2021, industry was already embracing that earlier generation, that first round of artificial intelligence technologies. And it was going into defense products to make them more competitive. The government was trying to manage that from the government side. And I felt at the time that the government needed to mostly just get out of the way because this was moving much more quickly than the government could control or necessarily wanted to. Competitive pressures were bringing it forward. What the government needed to be was a smart customer and help figure out what the applications were, what the problems were that most needed to be solved to point industry in the right direction. The second wave is really anchored in large language models. It's the more recent set of tools, and ChatGPT has been the forerunner. There's a pioneer in this that provide very creative capabilities to do text, coding, images, to generate products in a way which teams of people have had to do over a long period of time. That's really an amazing breakthrough. And the earlier versions of that had a lot of problems. The products are getting better. They're getting more efficient. They require massive amounts of computing power. Electricity demand right now is in part being dominated by the growth in data, processing and data storage both to support artificial intelligence applications. So it's still early stages. There's still different views about how long it will take to get to something like human intelligence that emulates human intelligence very closely and has some of the characteristics that we tend to associate with human emotions. Um, and how quickly the efficiencies will improve. And really, again, we're talking about automation, tasks that we've done that we may be able to do much, much more efficiently, much more quickly, and maybe with better quality than in the past. There are issues, of course, with human control. There are issues with bias. There are all sorts of issues here. But that's the next wave, and that's moving forward very quickly now.
Let I want to step back just because I think a lot of times we hear about these roles, but we don't know like your responsibility. Can you tell us like what was your responsibility as the Secretary of the Force? I mean, I know it has a long title, but what were like your day-to-day like responsibilities?
Actually, the shortest title I've had. The longest title, I think, was Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategic and Theater Nuclear Forces, parenthesis, Defensive Systems, close parenthesis. That was when I
Okay.
had the Strategic Defense Initiative back in the 80s, right?
Okay. Okay.
Secretary of the Air Force, it was pretty simple. If you look at the statute that establishes the job, there's a list of things, but it's pretty much everything that the Department of the Air Force does. And the mission of the Department of the Air Force is to provide the nation with a Space Force and an Air Force, both that are ready to do their missions. And that's do their missions today, do their missions in the next few years, and do their missions even beyond that. So it's organizing, training, and equipping the Air Force and Space Force. It spans everything from recruiting to basic training, all the way through the full career management of our senior professionals, enlisted and officer. It's the entire acquisition system of both the Air Force and Space Force and managing all of that. It's a vast enterprise. It's bigger. The other military departments are comparable, of course, but it's a huge budget. It's a very large number of people, about 700,000 total. And it's a very clear responsibility laid on the secretary to manage all that. The two service chiefs, the chief of staff of the Air Force and chief of space operations, if you look at the statute that defines their role, is to support the secretary. It's pretty straightforward and pretty short. Now, the actual division of labor between the service chiefs and secretary is, varies with personalities, right? But I took the job with a large, long, strong background in national security, particularly on the acquisition side, but also to some degree on the operational and support side. And I had things I intended to do with the services and to try to move them forward to be more competitive.
Can we talk about the acquisition side? What do you see happening now? What are we doing differently than we've done before? I know that they have some ideas about, consolidation through GSA. What are your thoughts on that? What do you see maybe what's worked in the past? What do you like? What do you not like?
I have seen probably as several cycles of attempts to reform acquisition.
Right.
And I've seen good and bad programs, and I know the difference, and I know what has worked and what has failed. Um, the problem with defense acquisition is that it has an enduring bad reputation. And so people are always looking for some form of acquisition magic, I call it.
Mm,
Something somebody's never thought of before that's going to fundamentally change how successful we are at delivering things quickly that are perfect, without any schedule or cost increases. That's a mirage, but we keep chasing these mirages. We keep trying to find acquisition magic. When I took over the acquisition job in 2012, 2011, I was asked by a reporter, was I going to be an evolutionary or a transformational leader? And I said, in this case, I'm going to be an evolutionary leader because it is not all screwed up as people believe, but it
mm,
has a lot of room for improvement. And we need to go, professionals need to go figure out how to make improvement in various aspects of acquisition and do a better job. A lot of it is about talent and expertise and training and experience. Some of it's about policy. A lot of it is about technical risk management. And so all these things can be adjusted to try to do a better job. And I tried to use data to inform our decisions on policies and so on. I did that successfully for several years. I had that job for about 5.5 years. Um, the attempts to chase, mirages about new ways to do business almost always fail. In fact, they always do fail. We had transformation under Rumsfeld. We had total system performance, I think, at one point. We had a version of acquisition reform, I can't remember what it was called at the time, back in the early 90s, that was trying to adopt a lot of commercial practices. Some of that actually made sense and worked pretty well. But for the most part, what people do is they wave their arms, they spit out some new buzzwords, and they say, things are going to be better now, so all our schedules are going to be shorter, and we don't need as much money. And
mm,
they lay out programs that way, without enough money and without enough time. And then we have
mm,
disasters, and we go from a pendulum swing to, we need to take more risk. We're not taking enough risk, which you're hearing now, to one of which was, we've taken excessive risk and we have to have more discipline. So we got to put discipline in the system. So in the 80s, when Goldwater Nichols was passed, it was about discipline. Fast forward a few years and it's about taking more risk. We've been 2 or 3 cycles of that since, and right now we're to take risk cycle. And so we'll get predictable outcomes out of that. I was at a conference with the service chiefs recently, and General Saltzman, the chief of space operations, was asked about taking risk. And what he said, I thought was absolutely spot on. It's not about just taking risk for the sake of taking risk. It's about managing risk intelligently. And there are times when you want to take a lot of risk and accept waste, which is what comes from taking risk, in order to get something that's really important to you in the field faster. And the classic example I have of that is MRAPs. When people were dying because of IEDs and we didn't have adequate protection, wasting some money to get things out fast that would give them better protection was absolutely the right thing to do.
mm,
And we spent $30 billion building MRAPs, and it saved a lot of lives. But as soon as those counterinsurgencies were over, we abandoned all of that inventory. Of the 30,000 odd, 28,000, I think is the number, MRAPs we bought, we only kept about 5,000.
mm,
Because while they were great for IEDs, they were not good for a lot of other things. So There are times when it makes sense to, break glass and move quickly no matter what. There are times when you need to be at least a little bit more prudent about what you do and plan a little bit more cogently. My approach to planning acquisition programs has always been, put together a stressful but not crazy schedule. Put together one that's going to put some time pressure on people and accept the fact that you're probably going to have some schedule slips. Also do make the investments you need up for manage the risk to mitigate the risk as much as you can. And then be prepared for some overruns and some adjustments. The average defense acquisition program, as of a few years ago, going back forever, and I don't know that there is any more recent data available, shows that R&D programs, research and development, overrun on average for major programs about 25%. I'd like to see that down to 10. I think getting it to zero it would be excessively risk avoiding and very inefficient. But I think we can do some smart things to get it down to something more like 10. And we were on that path when I left the acquisition job. Our average production programs in the early stages, the first 2 or 3 years of production, overrun by about 10%.
Mm,
Much less. We're much better at predicting production cost than development cost. And there are a variety of reasons for that. So understanding those realities and the history of programs where people put unrealistic schedules in place is abysmal. The Navy's A-12 was one. I worked for a while on that. I had that program. The Army's Future Combat Systems program, Future Imagery Architecture in the intelligence community. There are a whole bunch of them that when leaders who are not well informed about acquisition, who are amateurs, dictate arbitrary schedules that don't make any sense, people will salute and say, yes, sir, and they'll write a schedule, and then they'll have an abject failure. And I'm afraid we're headed towards some of those again.
well, what do you think? I know that another conversation that's been happening is the industrial base. That's been shrinking for 2 decades. What are some of the thoughts on that, the industrial base as a whole?
There's a lot of rhetoric about that right now. There have been some studies done on it. There are some weaknesses in the industrial base. And what we tend to do is we find that we don't have the production capacity we'd like to have or the lead time to get things we'd like to have when the demand suddenly surges. And we saw this in the fight against ISIS.
Hmm.
We saw this in some extent during the main years of the Afghan and Iraq campaigns, but I wasn't in the Pentagon for this. I was there for ISIS. And we've seen it more recently in the Ukraine case. We're trying to get conventional munitions out, for example, in a hurry. We didn't have the capacity we needed. The problem with that is that if you try to build production capacity for a wartime demand level, it's unaffordable. You just can't do it. And you can't stockpile everything you need for war. So again, you have to take a risk management approach. You have to come at it and say, okay, where are the points where I could make an investment that would really help me a lot in a certain contingency that might occur, and prioritize those. The unfortunate fact is that there's not enough money to buy the things that we already want to buy. So you're going to have to take money away from some of those things to apply it to the industrial base if you're not willing to increase the budgets overall. So I had a long list of things that I wanted to buy that I didn't have money for in the Air Force and Space Force. And before I buy excess production capacity that is going to be idle until there's a war that may be the war I predict or some other war, I've got a lot of other things I need to do first, right? So that said, the amount we're going to divert into the industrial base is going to be on the margins. It's not going to be dramatic, I think. But there are some things there that could be done. One area that we sought funds for repeatedly with some success, going back to the Obama and the Biden administrations, is in space producers, space sources of supply for some relatively low demand but very important products that are kind of unique. There are also some cases where you can use the Defense Production Act to capitalize things that industry doesn't see the return on investment to capitalize on its own. So I think working closely with industry, we can identify priorities for the government that are in the government's interest to assist industry with funding. And I would applaud that if that's what we do. But we got to get beyond the arm waving and the generalities and get to some detailed, thoughtful planning.
How can small and mid-sized government contractors best align themselves with the Air Force modernization goals?
Um, that's a great question. I think you need to build relationships with both the operational community and the buying commands. We tried to do some things that are in progress right now still, and I hope will continue. We tried to create what was the equivalent of a futures command, integrated capabilities command, we're going to call it. And a provisional version of that's been stood up. That will be essentially our organization on the operational side for the Air Force that will be looking at maturing technologies, emerging technologies that can have a significant impact and be positive for the Air Force. So that organization would be one that I would try to seek contact with. Another would be on the acquisition side, and companies should do both. On the acquisition side, we've created a technology development office under Air Force Materiel Command. That would be the counterpart to the Futures ICC, Integrated Capabilities Command, on the operational side. And those two would work very closely together. One would be focused on technical realism in support of the other, and the other would be focused on requirements for the Air Force and new opportunities to apply technology. We also were creating some centers of excellence, if you will, for acquisition support on the acquisition technical side of the house, also under Air Force Materiel Command. One for nuclear systems, one for aerospace systems, basically, aeronautical systems, and then one for information systems. So there would be points of contact there that people could interact with. There are other routes that people can explore, and people who have money to hand out are kind of attractive. Within the Air Force, obviously, Air Force Research Laboratories, but also Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, Strategic Capabilities Office, and Defense Innovation Unit. The thing you have to be careful about those last three is that none of them actually field capability. They do technology investments in things that are attractive, that appear to them to be attractive. To be actually fielded as a capability, you're going to have to get to a service. At the end of the day, that's where real capabilities are fielded. So it's important to build even if you may sink sources of funds that are in some of those other agencies, getting relationships and selling your product, if you will, marketing your product to the ultimate buyer is really important. And there are forums that are available, of course, to do that. For a lot of small businesses, let me just make this point too. A lot of the things that small businesses are developing are not end item products. They're products that are going to be embedded into a prime.
Mm,
And one of the things that, or a subcontractor, first or second tier subcontractor even. So one thing that I think this is work that was incomplete in both of my previous jobs, but forming an opportunity for small businesses who are very worried about loss of their intellectual property to be integrated into products that the government's buying without the threat of losing that to a prime, or IP to a prime.
right.
I think we probably, quite frankly, need better mechanisms to do that. In too many cases, startups are not going to be selling ultimately directly to the government,
Right.
even though they
Right.
may get technology and developmental funding up to some point through SBIRs or whatever vehicle. So I think, frankly, we need a better way to do that. Each of the major primes has their own, programs to look for technologies that could make them more competitive and try to bring them in. But that can be intimidating or seen as threatening by small businesses many times.
Right. Yeah. No, I've had friends that, like you said, some of the large defense contractors reached out to them to go in on some SBIRs, but again, they make them sign all kind of agreements and documents that, you're a tech guy, you're an innovator, like, hey man, I don't have lawyers to read all this stuff to see what I'm signing my rights away to. And that's what happens. So they get intimidated. Right. But that's interesting. What about, so we talked about small businesses. What about OCONUS? How does the Air Force, how are they buying things OCONUS for troops, for example?
We don't buy a lot OCONUS.
Okay.
We do buy, there are, and the F-35 program is a good example of that. There are a lot of original international participants who all have some industrial based share of the program. Various subsystems and components, parts, basically. So there is some there. I have tried over the years to get the DoD and the services to be more open to considering foreign possibilities. with modest success at best, probably. There are some cases where foreign suppliers have bailed us out when we had a problem.
Mm,
And, I think the fact that they've done that for us, I think should suggest that maybe we ought to be looking harder. There are also a lot of innovation, I think, available to some of our foreign partners. So, and I've worked with some countries that a lot of them have a subsidiary in the US, a lot of the primes.
hmm
And they can do pretty good business. I've worked with several of those. I'm not going to name any names, but if they have the right structural arrangement to do business in the United States, they can get a clearance, they can be effective, and they can sell to the government either through a prime or directly. And we do buy some things that way. Again, it tends to be more below the prime level, but there are some things bought that way. For people trying to go overseas from the US to find opportunities, I think we're headed into a little bit of a tough time here because particularly with Europe, which is where most of those opportunities tend to be. There are some in the Pacific also, but everybody has kind of a form of some kind of their version of America First, right?
hmm
Where a lot of our partners, their defense businesses tend to be very much about local jobs, domestic jobs, domestic opportunities. So it can be hard to break into some of those. But again, if you have something that's highly competitive, and makes their product much more attractive, then there may be opportunities there. I doubt the budgets aren't as big, the programs aren't as ambitious, generally speaking. So I think the opportunities are more nichey and more limited than they would be in the United States, but
Makes
they're
sense.
not non-existent.
Makes sense. Oh, how important is talent acquisition outside the traditional defense ecosystem?
Talent acquisition,
Talent acquisition.
enormously. At the end of the day, quality of the people matters first, and their capacity to do work. I just saw last night something that Secretary Hegseth just put out about how are they going to bring talent into the government. It was
Right.
mind-boggling. Um, but it was bashing universities, bashing elite universities, and we're no longer going to look at what school you went to, which is the main thing on your resume. I went, well, why not? I went to Caltech. I think that means something.
Sure.
If,
Right.
if somebody has a PhD in artificial intelligence from MIT, that means something.
Absolutely.
I'm
Right.
not indifferent to that. And people go through their entire high school careers aspiring to go to the best colleges and trying to
Yeah.
get better scores and so on. Um, and the best colleges attract the best capability.
Right.
It's a fact of life. And so for us to ignore that and it would is mind-boggling to me. It's going to be very discouraging to people, I think, what they just put out. But in any event, talent is everything. We spent a lot of time when I was in both the acquisition job for DoD and in the Air Force job, thinking and trying to manage and make careers more rewarding to people, give them opportunities to grow. Uh, I worked very hard to push for science and engineering expertise to be expanded. One of my background goes back to the Cold War. And during the Cold War, the Air and Space Forces, the Air Force was probably had the greatest technical talent. It had a very good pipeline for technical people, scientists and engineers. It emphasized the importance of those skills very significantly. And I would have said it was the strongest of the services at that time. And after the Cold War, a lot of that seemed to atrophy. And I found that there was a consensus about this, that after the Cold War won, you said, okay, we're not in a scientific technological competition anymore. We can relax about that and bring up people from different fields. So I tried to rebuild the technical wing, if you will, of the Air Force and Space Force. The Space Force is really interesting. It's only about 10,000 people. Its budget is about 65% research and development.
Mm,
It is an organization that is spending almost two-thirds of its money on research and development. It
mhm.
better know how to do that. It better have engineers who can manage those
Right.
programs, and it better demonstrate that those people are very important to the success of the service. So one of those people was just grabbed to go run the Golden Dome program. General Gritline, he had led Space Systems Command before he became the Vice Chief of Space Operations. So I don't know of anything more important, and that's true in all fields. It's not just about science and engineering, although that's very key right now. We're in a competition for technological superiority, military technological superiority. and we're up against a formidable opponent. China has 100 times as many MITs as we do. China has a vast population that is pushing very hard into technical fields. A lot of those people come to the US to go to graduate school. I see that this administration wants to cut back on that. I don't disagree with that.
Mhm.
We're training our adversaries.
Right.
And I think we need to be conscious of that fact and think more carefully about the degree to which we want to do that.
Interesting. What do you think about if we take it down to, and I know this may not seem related, but we talk about talent. We look at there's a shortage of trades in our country, plumbers,
Absolutely.
electricians, things like that.
Yes. And if people are listening and are interested in coming into the military, there's a good chance, good opportunity to learn one of those trades. Because we do need, electrical people, mechanical people, et cetera. We need people that are skilled in cyber in particular. Another thing I did when I was secretary was I created warrant officers for cyber and IT. The other services already had them, but the Air Force for some reason did not. And they had them back in the 50s, I think, and got rid of them kind of a long time ago. But those are fields where technical expertise, tradecraft, if you will, is incredibly important, and it's constantly changing. So you need people who are not just skilled in that area, but who stay current in that area.
Mhm.
And they become your trainers for other people. They become your leaders in that area. So we took some steps, and I think more needs to be done to enhance the capability of the Air Force and the Space Force in those areas. And that's true across DoD as well.
Oh, or you could
As we
start.
move towards more reliance on uncrewed systems in all domains, we're going to need, that's going to become much more important to us. And even there, we're going to bring in automation. So we're going to need people who can manage that and take care of it. So there is, as we talked about AI, there is I think, and some people have been talking very with alarm about this. A lot of the jobs that humans do are going to be increasingly automated.
Mm.
And that started some time ago, and it's going to continue and may accelerate dramatically if some of the predictions are right.
Uh, one of the areas that in the acquisition side that I noticed early is we started having more and more interns in the acquisition side.
That's a great recruiting tool. We bring people in as either co-op students or interns.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to them is they like the team they're on, they like the mission, they like the work they're doing, they like the environment they're working in. They feel strongly about the importance of the work and it's importance to the nation, and they stay. So getting people, and we have good co-op programs, we have good intern programs, getting people out of either undergraduate or graduate school,
Mm-hmm.
giving them a foot in the door to get started, it pays enormous dividends for the DoD.
Yeah, I think that personally, I just don't think enough young people are aware of these things. I think we could do a better job of marketing this stuff
I,
because
I,
I happen to be a contractor, so I see it, but the average student doesn't know these opportunities exist. They think about, they think about what they see on TV, what's being portrayed on TV.
you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of glamour associated with some of the, high-tech firms right now in particular.
Right.
They're attracted to people. So I take that as, I'm not in anymore to take it personally, I guess, because I'm out.
Sure.
I think you're right. I think the government could do a better job of telling its story, and reaching out to young people.
Yeah. No, I just see it because even with the contracting arena, a lot of the the smaller companies say, well, we're too small, we can't service government, or they don't want our technology, or just a lot of what's been, how do you say it? That fairy tale, not fairy tale. What is it? The story that has been told from generations and passed down. I think that still exists in a lot of our communities.
Yeah, I think you're probably
What I'm talking about, what I'm trying to say is that it's what they've heard, not what they've experienced.
right. Right.
So,
Yeah, as we moved away from post-Cold War in particular, right? There was a strong sense in the nation of the purpose of national security and the degree of threat we felt. Then, of course, we had about 10 years of, benign 10 years. Then we had 9/11. And then we spent about counterinsurgencies. And now we're coming out of that era and thinking about great power competition again. So I don't know that there's a national sense of uh, the need or the mission for national security, how important it is, or how much people can contribute, and what service either as a government employee, a civilian employee, or in the
Right.
military,
Right.
can provide to do that. I was asked in another forum yesterday about recruiting and prevalence, right? Propensity to serve is the term we use, and that being down. And a lot of that is because people look at, say, a period of 2 or 3 years or 4 years in the military as a hole in their life, right?
Hmm.
Why would I create this big hole? It's actually an opportunity to grow and to experience things and and develop skills that are going to be valuable to you for the rest of your life. But I don't know
Absolutely.
that people appreciate that nearly as much as they should out there.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think, like I said, we should figure out how we can, have that conversation, be spread and heard on commercials and TV and at Super Bowls and things like that,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Where people
And
are.
we're doing that. The government is doing that. And, 23 was a tough year for recruiting for everybody, including the Air Force. We put resources against it. We made some policy changes and we recovered in 24 and we had a very big backlog of people trying to come in at the end of 24. That's what's happening right now is the delayed entry programs from that were put in place in the previous administration are now providing the dividend that they provide. I don't know what's going to happen going forward.
Mm,
We'll say I'm afraid there's going to be the anti-DEI campaign that's going on right now. I think it's going to have a negative impact on certain communities on recruiting.
mm,
What it's going to do overall, I don't know. But I think in certain communities, it's the impression's being created that this isn't a welcoming place for me. So we'll see what happens.
right. Looking back on your tenure, what initiatives or decisions that you are most proud of?
I've been asked that question a couple of times. There are several. I think I look at it overall. I'll put three what I think are kind of big things on the list, and I'll save the biggest one for last. The thing I came in knowing I had to do right away was focus on modernization. And I created 7 operational imperatives that we needed to meet to be successful against China. And I put teams together figuring out what we needed to do to address those problems. We came up with about $100 billion of funding that we would like to have had over the 5-year plan that we do. We divided that up into essential, good to have, and high leverage, and then good to have. And we got about all the essential things were funded. I think that was a significant success. That included things like resilient space architectures, hardening our bases. One of the ones that's high on my list is uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft, the loyal wingman that a fighter pilot would have like 3 or 4 or 5 uncrewed fighters carrying weapons that he would control and operate as a formation. And we've got that on contract. It's going to be flying. The aircraft that are on contract will fly this year. We'll do a down select presumably, and we'll get them in the inventory within a couple more years. So I think that's one example of things coming out of that. But there are a lot of others. So the operational imperatives and the ability to fund the highest priority things on that list, I think is first on my list. That's one thing, modernization, moving it forward. The next thing is the set of changes we made throughout the Air Force in a number of areas, organizationally, how we do training, how we do exercises, how we're structured to make good decisions about investments as early as possible and get things funded. They were called Reoptimizing for Great Power Competition. And we announced 24 decisions about a year before I left. Those were about 80% implemented by the time I had left. And I think those are going to be an important refocusing the Air Force on all the things it needs to be doing if it might get into a major conflict with a peer competitor at any time. So that's the number 2 thing. The third thing is something that's more subjective, but it was something I articulated very early. I told somebody in some forum, I can't remember what it was, that if I could do one thing with the Department of the Air Force, it would be to create a sense of urgency about the threat. And understanding that we've got a big problem and we got to move fast just to stay even, to say nothing of staying ahead. And I feel that I did through some of those other mechanisms I talked about. I feel like I made a lot of progress with that. That both the Air Force and Space Force see the military challenge they face is much more of an urgent, I've got to get on with it or I'm going to lose kind of a problem than they did when I walked in. So those would be the three.
Well, well, what else is happening that we haven't covered?
There's a whole range of things going on out there right now. There's a lot of dramatic change going on. I was in the Pentagon today, actually. A lot of senior executives are leaving. They say that they're about readiness and warfighting, but many of the changes I'm seeing are going to be counterproductive, I'm afraid. You mentioned talent. A lot of talent is leaving. Under the guise of acquisition reform, there's a desire to move some programs forward at, I think, grossly unrealistic timescales. The Golden Dome is one of those. I'm told that the president announced the date of fielding in the Oval Office, but nobody had talked about that date until he announced it. So it came, out of God's lips, I guess. I don't know if you can look at it that way if you want to. Um, but here we are, right? And so people will build a program to that. It's going to be incredibly high risk and almost zero chance of success. So some of the things they're doing, I think, are going to be more wasteful than effective. Some of the cuts they're making. I've been through a lot of efficiency cut drills in the Pentagon. Um, Almost every time you have to take X amount out, 5%, 10%, whatever, and be efficient, right? Well, everybody's already trying to be efficient. Everybody's doing everything they can imagine to be more
Right.
efficient. There isn't this idea that there's tons of waste lying around waiting for somebody to just come pick it up and do something with it is crazy. Most of the organizations in the Department of Defense don't think they have enough money to do their mission. They
Mm.
feel like they need more to really be able to do the mission effectively. And they're all already looking for ways to be more effective. So the idea that, so cuts anyway become they're tagged as efficiency, but what they actually are is just content. And it's prioritization, and things that are lower priority just don't get done in some cases, or they get delayed indefinitely. And you would see that in places that in the Air Force that I inherited, like installations, support for our installations. You cannot take care of your buildings for quite a long time before a crisis happens. But that sort of thing is what gets done in that environment. And then you pay a big price for it later. You cannot do maintenance at the same level. You can cut back on that. So I'm seeing, frankly, a lot of damage being done under the rubric of improving efficiency and improving readiness for warfighting. The team that's come on board is very thin right now. It's now got all the service secretaries and the secretary, I think one undersecretary. They don't have a full team on board. That team has not had time to assess its actual situation and make
Mm.
recommendations to the senior level. They're just wildly cutting things. And they're forcing people out left and right. They're cutting the numbers of 4 stars. I don't know why that's a good thing. They're cutting the number of general officers in general. Why is forcing talent out of the department helping us be more ready? What is the study that says we have too many 4 star generals?
Mm.
It's ready, shoot, aim, basically, that's happening
Right.
right now. And I think a lot of negative consequences are going to come from it.
What do you think about the consolidation at the top of the top defense contractors acquiring all the smaller companies and reducing the amount of companies that can produce different things? Like,
There is a very normal business trend for primes to pick up small businesses that can enhance their competitiveness. And a lot of small businesses design their business plan around growing to the point where they become very attractive and get a high multiple when they're sold. And then that's the exit strategy, right?
hmm
Others want to grow, into a larger business organically and have that strategy. So this is all part of the capitalist system, and generally speaking, it's healthy. What we did too much of, I think, in the 90s was collapse the big firms together. And we realized that at some point. I had left government by then. I was actually on the other side of that in industry for a while. So I think further consolidation at the top would probably be a mistake. It's not what happens, and I spoke out about this when I was in the Obama administration. When the defense firms get too big, they get too powerful politically, and they start politically dictating what the Department of Defense and government do.
Mm.
They already influence that, and they would like to influence it more, obviously. They want their products to be bought, right? And
Right.
at some point, that political influence, that political power structure becomes negative from the point of view of the government, and you also lose competition. So I would not want to see more consolidation at the top. I like the new entrants that are coming in. The CCAs that I mentioned went to Anduril and General Atomics, both not from big primes.
Right.
And I think that's healthy. I think one of the things the government needs to do right now is take a look at the cost structures of the traditional primes versus the new entrants.
Mm,
I believe that the government has imposed cost structure on those primes that is a competitive disadvantage to them right now. They ought to
mm,
take a hard look at how to get rid of some of that. And again, it takes people who know what they're doing, looking at the details. You can't do that with a wave of your arm, certainly not with a chainsaw, right?
right.
You've got to actually understand what rules and regulations are adding burdens that aren't having a high payoff, but that do have high cost, and get rid of them. And you have to work with the Congress on that. The other thing people don't appreciate is that almost everything we do in regulation comes from a statute. It's how we implement statute is through regulations. So you can't change a regulation unless you change the underlying statute. So you have to work with the Congress on this. There have been a couple attempts at this, which I don't think have quite frankly succeeded. They weren't focused enough and didn't have the staying power to get, it's kind of boring work, quite frankly, going through the FAR and figuring out what you can get out of it. But that's kind of what we need to do. Congress has written some exceptions where you can get around all of that stuff. And some of the companies like Honorable, for example, some of the new entrants are taking advantage of that. And it isn't always available to the primes to do the same thing, although they can do it in some cases. So I think there's some structural things there the government needs to address.
So what's next for you professionally?
I'm keeping busy. I'm writing. I've got 2 books in the works. I'll put a plug in for my books here.
Okay.
One on future warfare, which is going to be out, I hope, within the next few months. It's uh, a unclassified update to a report I did for DARPA when I was out of government during the first Trump administration. And it talks about autonomy is a major feature of what I describe. The other is more of a memoir about my history in government primarily, and things that I've experienced there. I've gotten to see a lot of history, but I'm doing some things to help industry. I'm working with some consulting firms and some financial people. And I'm involved with a couple of nonprofits as well. So I'm keeping busy. It didn't take me long to fill up the inbox.
Yeah. No, and I mean, you've been working.
Gotta kind of be careful what else I do.
Yeah, well, I know that you work with some nonprofit organizations, so that's kind of been on one of your things for a long time now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Know about government contracting but not sure where to start, state, local, or federal? Sign up for a free 15-minute assessment call with one of our coaches. Visit govconeric.com/call, sign up today, and we will share with you our step-by-step formula that we've used to help thousands of students win contracts. Visit govconeric.com/call to sign up for your free 15-minute diagnostic today.
well, I appreciate you today, sir. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for spreading your wisdom. I look forward to your book coming out. I hope you'll let us know so we can pick up a copy of the book
Well, I'll come on
and
down.
support you, because we definitely want to be able to read it and learn. And I mean, you know what? Have you read Unit X?
Yes, I have.
Okay,
I haven't
okay.
read it. I've skimmed through
But
it.
you've skimmed through it,
I know
right?
the authors.
Okay.
The other, I have a book on acquisition and it's free if you want to get that.
Do you?
Yeah, I wrote an article basically every couple of months when I was AT&L, Acquisition Technology Logistics, when I was undersecretary, about acquisition, about some aspect of acquisition. And I had written about 30 of them by the time it was my last year in office. And I decided to put them together into a book. It's a government publication. It can't be copyrighted. It's called Getting Defense Acquisition Right by Frank Kendall. It's
Okay.
available if you want to get it, it's free to download from the Defense Acquisition University.
Ah, okay.
Because it's not copyrighted, anybody can sell it. And if you go on Amazon, you can buy a copy. I'm not selling it.
Ah, okay.
Entrepreneurs who scarf up anything that comes out of the government, put a price tag on it and sell it on Amazon.
I do see it on Amazon for sale.
Yeah, don't buy that one.
Okay. Get the free one off the
Get it for
DAU.
free. It's at Defense Acquisition University, and if you go there and do a search, I think you'll pop it up.
Yep. I have it right here on the screen.
There you go.
I have it on the screen.
Acquisition wisdom, 40 or so years of doing this stuff.
Wow. No, and you know what's interesting about that? See, we wouldn't know that,
Understood.
but
Understood.
that I'm happy, but I'm happy that you came on our show so we can share that with our community, and then
There you go.
we can read up on it and we can get the advantage over other people who've not read the book.
You should update that one and sell that one too.
So I appreciate you, sir. Thank you so much today. You know what? Why don't you close out with some parting words for our audience before we let you go?
Um, we're living in really interesting times right now in this country. I think we're facing challenges like we've never seen before, and I think people have got to step up and recognize that fact and react. I was up at Harvard, actually, one of those elite institutions, a couple of weeks ago, and I've been writing some things which are, pretty pointed. And I was asked why I was being political, because I've always been a technocrat, basically. I've had political preferences, but I've mostly focused on very professional type things. And my answer was, I'm not being political. I'm trying to protect our democracy. And right now, I think the threats to our democracy are actually very real and very serious. And we need to be paying attention and reacting to that. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you, sir. Well said. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you. All right. Good to meet you.